Oftentimes, theology is looked at as some esoteric and scholarly and professor like pursuit. And yet, the Bible doesn't really approach theology this way. In fact, the Bible approaches theology in the sense that if it doesn't apply to everyday life, then what good is it? And the Bible makes several different statements along these lines. And today I'm going to be talking with Stephen Guerra. And he has his own podcast that we'll be talking about, where he talks about theology and history. And we're going to be delving into this topic. But first, go ahead and go into the description and click on that link for a free ebook that will really bless you. And also subscribe and follow this podcast so you can get more great free content. All right. So without further ado, let's do it. Well, welcome back to Kingdom Over Coffee. I've been having some newer guests over the past couple episodes. I had some return guests there for a few, checking back in with some old friends. But I have a new friend here with me today. I have Stephen Guerra. Right? Did I say it right? Did I do okay?
That's good. Yeah,
yeah.
Perfect.
How you doing, man? How you doing, Stephen?
Great. Thank you so much for having me on.
No problem. Stephen and I are part of the same Life Audio network. So if you're listening to this on Life Audio, then you got two guys here from the Life Audio network. And so we just kind of connected on that platform. And so we decided to have a little conversation today. But before we get started, Stephen, just introduce yourself to people.
Well, my name's, as you mentioned, Steve Guerra, and I'm a history podcaster amongst many things. And I have two podcasts, well, three currently. The History of the Papacy podcast, which will probably be a more what we lean into today, and that's a view of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church, and through a non-religious lens, but that by definition, we have to talk about theology, Christology. So I don't shy away from that because I feel like that is the critical part of history. I also have another podcast, Beyond the Big Screen, about movies and the history behind movies and thinking about movies. And then I have another upcoming history podcast coming out on organized crime, which people should look out for very soon. It's going to be called Organized Crime and Punishment, a history and crime podcast. So I have a couple irons in the fire. Wow.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. And you live in the Austin, Texas area?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, good deal. Well, when Stephen and I were kind of emailing back and forth discussing, what our topic should be, Stephen mentioned how maybe we could translate theology, into real life, and as a pastor myself and an author, it's one of those things that I've had to learn because, I love reading and learning, and I can get really intellectual with the whole thing. And that kind of gives me some energy. But for most people, that's a boring thing to do, right? For most people, that is a boring sort of pursuit. And so as we're trying to encourage people, it's not like you don't want to talk about theology because there's a reason it's important. And yet I think people want it to be kind of revealed and shown how our everyday life can be infused with some of these truths. So why is this sort of an important topic for you?
I think I am a Christian, and I think from learning all about the early church and the theological strife that they went through, it's not academic, and it clearly wasn't just a purely academic pursuit for the people in the first several centuries, and then the councils of the church that went from the 300s to the 700s, and then if you're a Catholic, councils that went after that, and just generally in Christianity, councils. I mean, even going up into the 1400s and the 1500s with the reformers, theology for them wasn't just an academic exercise. Maybe you could argue that with Martin Luther, it kind of started as an academic exercise, but it very quickly caught steam because he captured something that people were thinking about theology. And I think it's almost like, I feel like in maybe in the modernity, we want to, even as amongst Christians, like separate, this is the spiritual aspect, let's be nice and stuff like that, and the theology, that's kind of the pastor or the priest, they can debate about that or whatever, but it really doesn't affect the people sitting on the pews.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I mean, I would argue that a lot of the academic intellectual part of it did start, second century or so. Some of those guys, Origen and Ignatius, and some of those guys were very steeped in philosophy and that sort of academic life. But I think, but you're right in the sense that there's that scriptural charge to to fight the good fight, right? To stay true to the faith, to what is, and there are a lot of, especially in the New Testament, there are a lot of very theological statements. Very, they could be, if some could think they're hyperbole almost, they're so amazing, right? They're so, like, not out there, but they're so kind of transcendent statements. But obviously those were important for Paul or Peter to write down and send to churches, right? It wasn't just be nice, right? Like, they had those too, like but that was usually an outgrowth, like, looking at Colossians and Ephesians specifically, the first half of both of those letters are statements like, Christ holds all things together by the word of his power, like these like really like metaphysical statements. And then he goes, so therefore, husbands, love your wives, right? Like he translates it into real life. And I think you're right. I think for a lot of us, especially in the American sort of system, we, and the West, maybe we've put that as, well, that's the pastor's job to know that stuff. But obviously these letters were written to churches to read aloud. It wasn't just for the leaders or teachers.
Yeah, I was thinking that, and I 100% agree with that. It's You're the teacher, the pastor, the priest, whatever. They're the teacher, but we're not just the passive part of that, sitting in the pew or in the naves. It's like any education; we have to take it in, and we have to think about it, and we don't necessarily have to be experts, but we have to understand what you're teaching us.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of two scriptures along those lines where Paul says in 1 Corinthians, 14, he was like, let two, at the most three prophets, which we could say maybe speakers or preachers, right, speak. And then when he's giving kind of the order of worship, he's kind of correcting them. But then he says, and then let them sit down, and then the church judges it. Then the church, like, they don't critique it in the sense of, like, with a red pen or something, but they're judging as if this is from God or not. Like he's literally giving like this empowering statement to the rest of the church. Like, you have a job to respond to this, to say whether or not this is legit or not. Because if it is, then we should do it, right? Right. Like, if whatever these guys are saying or women are saying, then if it's legit, then we should probably do this, right? If it's from God. Yeah. But if it's not, then we should have that discussion. Then, because in Corinthians, he was correcting people who were just using their gift for their own fame and for their own, sort of pleasure. So I agree with you. Like, it's Luke. The Gospel of Luke was written to one guy. Like this is, it's not just for the special. We're all special in that sense to know this theology.
I think also, I mean, you look at, say, the parables, they're teaching statements, and they're so chock full of theology, and that's where the later people, the first generation or the church fathers, they were drawing out inspiration and drawing out the theology of, what does this organization, this religion that we're slowly forming here, what does it mean? They're pulling directly from the source text. And I think if you drift away from what the formation is, then are you really following what the meaning? Like, you need to be anchored in some place within I guess in the modern parlance, or in our secular life, we'd call it our ideology. It's, what do you think about something?
Hmm. Well, for our listeners, and I haven't gone over this on this podcast, but if you've done study, then you know this, right? For our listeners, a lot of our listeners don't really know kind of the formation of even the New Testament in those first 2 or 3 centuries. Like, the New Testament didn't exist, obviously, when Jesus was born, right? The Old Testament, they didn't call it that, but the writings of the Old Testament, generally speaking, were in the Septuagint and all that sort of stuff. Like, that existed, and a lot of people don't realize that they were trying to teach this new religion using the Old Testament. So when they were referring to scriptures, generally speaking, in the New Testament, they were speaking about these Old Testament scriptures, And so, but as that went, and again, a lot of people don't see this, but maybe you do. And I know you're Greek Orthodox, right? Do you guys do much with the Apostles' Creed?
Well, as far as I know, the Apostles' Creed is more of a Western, Roman Catholic thing.
Okay.
But we'll say the Nicene Creed of 381, the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. That's a lot of syllables for it. But that's, I guess if you were to translate that, that would be called the symbol of faith, or the, what would in the Protestants,
the rule of faith is what they kind of call it. And what a lot of people don't realize is that, so the early church believed in this thing called apostolic doctrine. Okay, so the early church believed in this thing, and they get it from Matthew, because Jesus didn't write a book. He raised up disciples, right? And especially these 12 guys. And he commissions them at the end of Matthew specifically to go out and teach others what I taught you. So the early church believed that those guys were specifically anointed or empowered to pass on the teachings of Jesus, right? And Jesus, who was, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, and like, Jesus was the goal here. So they believed that the apostles had been given the ability to pass that on. Now, again, there might be we could argue whether or not there are other apostles ever in history, but the early church believed those guys had something special that no one else does, which is why we're not adding to the Bible anymore, because they really believed. So they believed that those guys were passing down what they call apostolic doctrine, which were the teachings of Jesus. And so in the early church, we're really trying to figure out what these guys were teaching, right? Because like you're saying, like, if we get away from Jesus's teaching, then we're not really following him, And so the Nicene Creed was the first one where they kind of set down what is apostolic doctrine. And there were a lot of hiccups along the way. Let's just put it that way. There's a lot of tension. There was, the legend of Santa Claus smacking the guy and all that stuff. There was a lot of tension in that, but they really felt that was central for that reason, because Jesus didn't only, like, he was the Word, right? So Jesus didn't only, yes, he died, and that's important, and rose again, but what did he teach? What was he trying to share? What were his words,
And you go back to that very first controversy that precipitated why there would have to be a council to even discuss this in 325 AD, of the Arians and the Trinitarians. That's such a fundamental difference,
right,
between what people think, and whether I would assume most of the people of your listeners are religious, but that's a key function of salvation. I mean, clearly God will choose his own and all that stuff, but you've got to decide, is Jesus just a great person, but essentially just a human being, maybe the best of them all, or is he a part of a three person Godhead? That's a totally different. Those are two different religions. When you get down to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And yeah, and the Nicene Creed is really sort of, and the Apostles' Creed is pretty close, by the way. They're pretty similar, but it's one of those things where it's not super short, but it's really not that long either. No. It's not like it's like, it's fairly. But what I love about the Creed, which they, again, discussed a lot. I mean, this was really debated, and is that there's simplicity in it. So there's theological statements, but there's also narrative statements. He was born of a virgin. He died, and on the third day rose. Like there's some essential narrative facts as well, because those have theological repercussions too, right? If he wasn't born of a virgin, then we can't say he was, begotten of God or whatever, born of the Holy Spirit and therefore divine or whatever. So there's, and so kind of going back to our topic, like theology does matter for our everyday life. Right. And that's my point about, even with the Nicene Creed, like we can talk about like, okay, it's important that we know the truth and that's good. But it's also because it is connected to our life. Like Jesus dying mattered because he was both God and man. Right. But so it's, and the way we live from that truth is going to matter, because if we believe we are commissioned, or all of those sort of theological things that we can believe, and I think so often, especially in the West, we've and maybe in the Greek Orthodox, you can correct me, maybe you guys are a little different, but it's like we have this idea of, if I believe something, that's just like a mental acknowledgement that it's true. But in the Bible, if you believe something, you're going to live it. Like we've kind of separated what we believe and what we do in modern Western Christianity. So I don't know how the Greek Orthodox view that.
That's kind of above my my knowledge grade, but I would say that that's a great point. Is that I think in the West, because clearly I'm a person of the West as much as anybody, they were separating all of these things. And that's probably something that is fairly recent in the grand scope of things within the last couple of 100 years.
Oh, sure.
Where just people didn't believe that. Like just the idea of separation of church and state would have been completely alien, and not very long ago, where now it's our complete paradigm of reality. And I think separating these things that weren't always separate. So we have to retrain our minds when we're thinking about and putting ourselves in the place of people who lived in the 300s and the 400s, all the way back to the earliest time of the new common era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I'm also just thinking about the scripture, which is somewhat controversial, and was controversial even at Nicaea, right? Because one of the reasons James wasn't controversial, but that was kind of iffy whether it was going to make it into the canon, was faith without works is dead. Is it grace alone? But they ended up realizing like those aren't two separate statements. Like he wasn't saying you're saved by works, but you reveal what you believe by what you do. And so that's the argument James is making. And I think that it's important for us to kind of, like you're saying, to retrain our thinking to say, well, what I do is what I actually believe. I can say a lot. You can teach a parrot to mimic anything, right? But what I actually do, how I live my life, is going to reveal kind of what I believe. Do you have, on this topic, do you have any sort of theological statements or ideas that you found, like when you really start to kind of consider them, that it's kind of changed the way you live, or you found it with others maybe?
I think that's a great question. I think one of the thing when I think it's looking at these theological ideas and not just kind of putting them in the back of my mind like, oh, that's in the academic bookshelf, that
Hmm.
these things are things that I should really be thinking about, and that they lead to other things that I can't think about, and then finding people who can lead you through these discussions and these thought processes, and that you don't have to do it alone. Like, I think so much
Mm.
is that, oh, let me take, read another book about theology, or let me read let me sit in my room and read the Bible myself. And I think you really have to think about them and discuss them, and then think about them some more. Like, I think going into the process, that it's not going to be something that you're going to figure out in one day. I think maybe it's taking it to the academic part and the mental part, you can take it too far, but it has to be a part of the equation of your spirituality, I guess you might say.
Hmm.
And I don't
Now,
speak for anybody but besides myself. So, and I'm just kind of spitballing here, but I think that, like I said with my podcast, I'm doing it from a historical point of view, but I've certainly been informed by what I've read.
oh, sure. Well, but I think that you're making a good point in the fact that we aren't supposed to do this alone, right? That we are supposed to have relationship with each other and deal with these truths in a community, and not by ourselves, right? I mean, God gives each person a gift, and they were meant to encourage everybody else. And so, if we try to kind of isolate ourselves, then we can easily kind of get off track, because we don't have that sort of natural, community that, and that's good, even if in almost anything, right? Being, if you're isolated, you can just get off track on almost anything that you do. Having other people with input and accountability, um, can really be good. And while you were talking, I was kind of reminded of kind of another thing that a lot of modern Christians, especially evangelicals, um, don't really, I don't know if they don't understand it, or they just don't kind of deal with it, is the biblical idea of meditation, right? And I think maybe because the Eastern mysticism of meditation is kind of a common, view of what meditation is, but the Bible has a lot of instruction about meditating on God, meditating on His Word, and that doesn't mean, like, Eastern mysticism just says open up your mind for anything, just be nothing and let the universe fill it or something, which is
Yeah.
dangerous. But the biblical idea is you take an idea, like, what does it mean that you are three in one? And you just meditate on it. You just sit in it, and you just take time and meditate on that, or have conversations about it. Have you found yourself doing that as you go through kind of your podcast, when you go over kind of some of the different ideas?
Yeah, I think for sure. And I think another thing that I really never thought about, and I do a lot of episodes on the Bible and the creation of the Bible, is sure, we have the Bible as a book, and there's a lot of historical reasons why it is in that format of a standalone book, but it's not necessarily, it's an anthology if you look at it in literature, and it's not meant to be read necessarily from cover to cover. And that's why any tradition has the order of the readings for daily readings, and there's a certain Old Testament passage that
Yeah,
goes with a certain gospel passage that goes with
good.
a certain letter, and there's different combinations therein, but it's meant to, each one of those is meant to inform each other, and it's all theologically based. They didn't just mishmash them together and fold them
Oh,
together like just stack a deck of cards. You're meant to connect all these different threads together.
Oh, the man, yeah, I totally agree with that. I was not raised in a liturgical tradition, and if anything, we were speaking before we were recording, if anything, as I got more into some of the charismatic side of the evangelical and learned a lot in that sort of realm, I would have been more against the liturgical, right? I would have been more resistant to it. But from what you're saying, God really had to teach me for a while, there's real power in the liturgy, like you're talking about. Like it forces us to go through the Bible in a very, I don't know about linear, but it go through it in a certain systematic way that I think, like, if you just rely upon one, usually in a church, it's, evangelicals, one pastor, and like God's only shown him so much, right, in his life. And what liturgy does is kind of forces you to go through all the ideas, all of the sort of ups and downs of the Old and the New Testament, and all of these kind of forces you to go through this whole, see it as a whole. And I think the Greek Orthodox has a lot of liturgy in it, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's very liturgical, and each service there's the primary service, I guess you might say it, on Sunday, but there's basically services all day round of maybe not in your local church, they might not be doing that, but in different monastic communities. And this, it goes probably for the Catholics as well, that but each one of those services throughout the day has a set routine to it, and certain readings, and there's some variability to that, and that's developed over time. But it's, interestingly enough, there's a book called the Travelogue of Etheria that was written in the 300s, of a woman from Spain. The book is scholars have a general idea of how long this book was, but they only have about the middle 2/3 of it. A little bit of the beginning is gone, and a little bit of the end is gone. And this woman, presumably rich, because she traveled from Spain and then went on basically a tour of Egypt and the Holy Land, kind of cruise through Anatolia, and then the book just ends in Constantinople. Presumably, maybe she goes home, maybe she doesn't. But this was an actual log that this woman wrote, and she talks about that in Jerusalem. She was there around Easter time, and it went into some detail about the liturgical things that she did, and they sound very similar to things that people do today. So these things were kind of in the works, and they developed along the way. But the early Christians definitely were liturgical in a way.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, and definitely by, like you're saying, by the 300s, definitely. So just one last question, and then we'll have to wrap it up here. But is there one thing, because again, a lot of people, especially in the evangelical world, and that's usually mostly who this podcast goes out to, don't really know a lot about, like, the church fathers and some of that early stuff. Is there something that you've learned that you just thought, man, like that was really an interesting thing, or something that really impacted you as you were kind of doing some of your own research along those lines?
I think for me, the time that I found that was the most fascinating, and I think it's probably the most complicated to me, was the around the time that Constantine legalized Christianity, because Christianity, and then that playing into the sort of the separate that time period where Christianity becomes a legal religion, and then eases into becoming the official religion of
Right.
Christianity, and how the politics of being tied into a state play into it. And then, to me, probably the most surprising, and the thing that I had to really think about the most, is that, but how Christianity grows out of Second Temple Judaism, and that there was something really fascinating going on in the time around with the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans and this whole intellectual tradition of what was going on amongst Greek Jews and Jews that were living in Palestine and Jews that were living in the diaspora. And they had all these different ideas going on. And you can see the lines that Christianity took certain of those ideas and really ran with them. And that's why we have so many things like the book of Revelation, that's an apocalypse that's very similar to Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
And that whole process of how that was figured out and what Christianity is, I don't think I could ever learn enough about it. In a different world, I'd go back and study that full time.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think a lot of people realize how the synagogue system, like I said, even the existence of the Septuagint, like led to, which was a canon of sorts, which was really a collection, like you're saying, it was more a library, an anthology, which led to this idea, well, maybe we could have that again from the, apostolic Christian era, just like, kind of, we need the Return of the King finish out from, the Two Towers and Fellowship of the Ring. We need to finish this thing out. But a lot of those ideas did come from Judaism and just how much the Book of Enoch and the Maccabees and like some of these things really influenced early Christianity and even some of Jesus's teachings. Like if you really start to learn it, you're like, oh, that's where Jesus, like Jesus wasn't in a vacuum. He was using things that people understood to kind of speak something new in a certain sense. And it's fascinating.
And if I could say one more thing that really,
Sure.
this one I think is so seemingly simple, but it blew my mind, is just the idea of the modern book. It's the codex is the technological term for a book that the pages are bound together. In early Judaism, it would have been all on scrolls, and scrolls were a pain in the neck to use. And
Right.
the idea that let's put this together into a technology of a book that you can flip through, it absolutely, that is the thing that probably was one of the biggest things that allowed Christianity to spread so quickly, was a technology. Just like if you fast forward 1,500 years later with Martin Luther, if he didn't have access to the printing press, he
That's
probably
right.
would have just been some guy writing stuff down in the middle of Germany and nobody would have ever heard him. But he had this access to a technology that just let the things that he was thinking about and writing just explode. And
Hmm.
I think you can't discount that certain things have, that technology had such a place.
Oh, absolutely. That's absolutely true. And you could say that even from the transition from even under Moses, right? The transition from a more verbal sort of narrative and handing down stories to Moses growing up in a culture of papyrus and saying, "Oh, we can just write this stuff down, guys,"
Yeah.
I mean, and the Pax Romana is a very popular sort of idea that as much as oppressive as maybe the Roman government was, they also did build safe roads
Yeah.
that allowed Christianity to spread at the same time. So they're all very fascinating discussions, which you have on your podcast, I'm sure. And so why don't you just kind of take a minute and let people know where they can find you, where they can find your podcast and all that sort of stuff.
I'm a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, which is a part of Salem, which is the umbrella for Life Audio, and then the history side of it with the Parthenon Podcast, with other great podcasters like History Unplugged, Eyewitness History, This American President, uh, Key Battles of American History, vlogging through history. And there's even, it's growing as we speak. My particular podcasts are the History of the Papacy podcast, and then the upcoming Organized Crime and Punishment, which it sounds like it's a true crime, but it's I make sure that all my podcasts are minivan safe. So as much as you can make true crime, I wouldn't say it's for all audiences, but all audiences could certainly listen to it. Uh, You can find all of those at my website, a2zhistorypage.com, or at parthenonpodcast.com.
All right. That's awesome. A2zhistorypage.com. And what was the other one? Parthenon.com?
Parthenonpodcast.com.
Parthenonpodcast.com. Awesome. Well, I'm going to put that in the description, and that way people can find you. Are you on the socials and stuff too?
You can find, I'm not as much into the social medias as I should be, but you can search for A2Z History on Facebook, Twitter, and you'll be able to find me there. Twitter, cool. Not so much, but I am definitely not big on social media, but you can follow me there. The best place to go is definitely to the website.
Awesome. Great. Well, Stephen, this was awesome, and I appreciate your time. And I think we could have talked for another probably hour or two. I think.
Oh, absolutely.
And because I don't run like I said, I don't run across as many people who know about a lot of those transitions from, around Jesus's time to the early church and all that. So maybe we'll have to do it again sometime. So now that we're kind of wrapping up, why don't you just kind of pray for our listeners and just and encourage them? All right.
Well, I want to thank you so much again for having me on, and let's see. Thank you, God, for giving us this day, and thank you for allowing us to have this conversation. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on us. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day and blessed day.
Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, bro.